Hey everyone, welcome to the Horse Geeks podcast, where we are looking at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer. With me, as always, is Deb Romero, certified Alexander Technique instructor. So we just spent 3 podcasts going into Newton's 3 laws of motion and explaining them, giving a little bit of sort of practical application. But today's podcast, we wanted to kind of tie it together. So I forgot to come up with a title for the podcast today, but we'll figure that out at the end.
How
But
about
basically,
forces in sit to stand?
forces in sit to stand. And the first thing is to kind of pull together, look at all 3 forces or laws of motion, the 3 laws of motion together in a kind of a summary, and then look at a practical application of that. So there's a specific groundwork or specific Alexander technique exercises that I think we can pull those 3 ideas together in what AT work calls a chair exercise, right? So the 3 laws of motion, Newton's laws of motion, the first law is, the short version is inertia. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. A body at rest tends to stay at rest until acted upon in the same direction at the same speed until acted upon by an unbalanced force. So we're just going to call that the law of inertia. The second law of motion is force equals mass times acceleration, and the vector quality of force always has direction and magnitude. So we're just going to call that the law of force. It explains how forces are generated. And then the third law of motion is basically for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction, which means for every force action, there is an opposing direction of force that is equal in magnitude. So we're just going to call that the law of action reaction. It basically means that forces come in pairs. So what does that mean? Because all 3 of those laws apply in a single moment or within microseconds of each other as we move around the planet or ride a horse, right? So inertia, as I was sort of trying to think, how do you make this so simple? Because we're talking about motion. So the law of inertia sort of describes what it takes for a body to change motion, right? So it's a change of motion, where the second law talks about initiating motion. So the mass accelerating initiates force. Force always has direction and magnitude. So it's sort of talking about initiating or generating forces of motion. And then for the third law, for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction, talks about during motion, how objects or bodies interact, how the forces interact. So I would say there's kind of like, how do we change motion? How do we generate motion or direct the force and the amount of motion? And then how do we interact during motion? Right. So again, those are pretty general, but that's why there's 3 laws of motion. Each one is sort of describing a particular aspect of motion. Right. So how does it start and stop? How does it change direction? How does it initiate or choose direction or increase, decrease in magnitude? And then how do forces interact during motion? Those are really the 3 laws of motion kind of encapsulated. So that way we can see it's kind of important, because especially when we're on a horse, we're going to be working in motion, right? Even if you go to Walmart and put a quarter in the little horse outside, the whole point of it is motion. The only horses that you're happy if they stand still are sawhorses.
True.
So even a hobby horse, right? Rocking horse. It's always about motion when it comes to horses. And then we move around the planet and do stuff. So motion is always happening in our own body. So to sort of look at some real examples and maybe break it down, I asked Deb today to talk about the Alexander technique work specifically the chair exercise. So it's funny because in working on my own riding skills, I found Alexander technique particularly helpful. The instructor knew nothing about horses and didn't need to, right? Deb happens to know a lot about horses, but not all AT instructors do, but they do know about bodies. And I kind of had to laugh because I go, here I am taking lessons on how to stand, how to sit, how to walk, how to pick something up. Yeah. And I go, those are all the things I think I knew how to do, right?
What am I doing? What? I know how to do that.
I know how to do that. But the difference is in how the forces of emotion are initiated, directed, and used, how we deal with inertia. So, very specifically, how we as a mechanical body generate or manage forces that have specific direction and magnitude. So, balance is all about an equalization of forces.
Right.
Right? So, an equalization of forces, in other words, all the forces coalescing into one direction or opposing forces being equalized.
Yeah,
Right. And
that's all about what we work with in the Alexander world. And a lot of people, like you were saying, why are we getting in and out of a chair?
why is that a lesson?
Why do that?
Why is what
Why did I do that
usefulness?
for 3 years, almost an hour every day in school? What is up with
What's the
that?
point of that?
What's the point? The main point is almost every habit that we have comes up in that exercise.
Right. So, just to remind people, balance is a point of static equilibrium. It's a point of stillness within all the forces.
Right.
So, our mechanical use is directly related to how we manage forces and generate forces, and how we manage or generate forces influences our mechanical use. They're one and the same. And so I can get in and out of a chair functionally, but just like I can ride and not fall off. So,
Right.
what's the difference between balancing and just having a gross or basic level of stability?
Right. Right. So we talked before about the internal forces and some of the external forces, and the internal forces are muscles, ligaments, bones, joints is what we have to work with, soft tissue. And the external forces, one of them we talked about was gravity, and we all know what that is. That's kind of, we think of it as a pull down. And I don't know if we talked about in chair work, it's the ground reaction force. So wherever you're meeting the ground, your feet, your bum on the chair, when you go to initiate a movement, say you did it on a scale, you're stepping on a scale, you see that those numbers
Change
dramatically. That's the ground reaction force that meets the gravity. So we
right.
have
So
one force, this
we did talk about forces acting at a distance and contact forces.
right, so it's about the
yes.
same thing. This is just specific, like to chair work. And we use our internal forces to work with or against the external forces. And what I found really interesting when I did, I looked up the research paper on alexandertechniquescience.com, is we actually have a few options on how to do that. So we have what we call a postural strategy. And the postural strategy is very mechanical, and it usually involves some sort of stiffening. So you can think of co-contracting, or if you're a rider, gripping, so you're pretty much, it's a physical manifestation of that movement. Or we can do what we call a dynamic matching. So you're talking about opposition. That's what that is, that dynamic matching and opposing the force. And that actually is generated from the central nervous system.
Oh, as opposed to muscle tension.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, what was the second phrase you used?
It's called dynamic matching.
Okay, so
Or you could
dynamic
say
matching,
opposing, dynamic opposing, whatever.
but that use of the body is generated through the nervous system, where
Right.
you're saying posture, or like how we get up and down into a chair as a postural use is usually managed more muscularly.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is to remember, and I think this is one of the big qualities of the Alexander work, is we have a choice.
Yes.
We can use ourselves mechanically and heave ourselves out of the chair and use all this effort, or could we step back and tap into our central nervous system? It might be a little bit slower at the beginning, but that gives us that dynamic matching of forces instead of arguing with the forces.
So you're saying arguing with the forces might mean excessive, something excessive, as opposed to matching the force would be sort of minimal.
Right. So we always want to stay without, we don't want to shorten around the activity, whatever that activity is, riding, driving. We can certainly, when you're driving in a car, instead of being taken over by the car or the seat and slump, we can use opposition force against the back of the seat and meet that to keep us vertical.
Ah, got it. Even the steering wheel, we could pull it
Exactly.
towards us, or we could
Yep.
push it away from us.
Right. We can either, be sucked into it or lengthen and use eccentric muscle loading to do the task, if that makes more sense.
So tell me what the chair exercise is. Just what do you do in that exercise for AT work?
What are you? Well, it's
You get up
pretty.
and down out of a chair?
Yeah, we get up and down out of a chair. We're
I mean, really,
playing.
that is the exercise. I'm not being
We're
like
not lying.
sarcastic.
We're
It
not
really is the
lying.
exercise, is to get up and down out of a chair.
Yeah, is how can we find without the least amount of effort to get in and out of a chair?
That's okay. So that's the point or the purpose of the exercise.
Yeah.
Is what's the most efficient, least amount of energy spent to get in and out of a chair.
Exactly.
So we all already get in and out of a chair, but the point of going through that motion, which we all think we already know how to do, is to question, how do we do it? And what is there a better, more efficient, which could be more comfortable, less stressful to our bodies, could be more or less damaging to our bodies, could be more or less effort for our bodies, depending on how we do it.
Right.
So
So it's
that's
all about the how, not the end result of getting out of the chair.
got it.
Yeah.
So what are you looking for as an Alexander instructor, Alexander technique instructor? What are you looking for and how do you help people with that?
That's a really good question, because I don't know if we're really looking, as in with our eyes. We may be using our eyes, but we usually have hands on the person. And I can usually sense a level of tension or a level of shortening.
That's so interesting because that's like the writer's contact.
Yes.
It's just that physical touch transmits an incredible amount of information through changes in force.
Exactly.
Right. So, and that's the sort of Newton's third law, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so we feel that dynamic interplay of forces. And that's the same. So you're saying you see with your eyes, maybe you hear what people say or how they describe it. But most importantly, you're using a physical touch to really get the information from the person's body like a rider would from a horse's movement.
Yes.
Okay.
So we can pick up things like you said with our eyes and our ears, but they may not always be the truth. So that just that another level of communication of, well, this is what I see and this is what I hear, but what else can I find out
Mm.
um, about what's going on?
And so, depending on what you feel, I'm sure there's a huge variety of things to be felt. Then, what do you do to help somebody? Like during a lesson, how would you guide to a better use if that's the objective?
Yeah, we're always pretty much focusing on the spine and its relationship to gravity and how it moves. So making sure that from the top of the head to the person's tailbone, that that piece is functioning well. We may even look at, which I found real interesting, is where the feet position are, which I thought would be a fascinating topic to discuss with riders. Is, are we, when we go to get in and out of a chair, are we pushing from our heels or are we on the balls of our feet? And how do we manage those forces with that?
So just where the weight is on your feet
Where the
be-
pressure or weight, whatever you want to call it, where is the
before you
rider?
sit down and when you're sitting down and when
Right.
you're getting up, because those would
Yeah.
be the three phases of sitting in and out of a chair, is preparing to sit, sitting, and getting up.
Right.
So sitting down, sitting, and getting out of the chair. And you're right, the weight could shift on our feet the entire time.
Right. And we as humans have a habitual choice that we take. Or what about if our feet are way out in front of us? So if you can imagine in your chair right now, if your feet are way out in front of you, how are you going to, you're going to have to use a lot of momentum.
And your arms
Yeah.
to
It's going to
really
be
to
a,
propel your torso forward over your feet. So the closer your feet are, the easier it gets.
and even more specific, the closer your center of mass is over that base of support.
I was going to ask you, like the weight on the feet. The weight on the feet is one way we can experience how forces are working internally. So when we're standing, our feet actually give us quite a bit of feedback about our central line of force and our relationship to gravity. And then friction is a little different, but just our body weight either being unequal or equal in opposing forces, right? So if we think of balance as equal but opposing directions of force, we have three planes in our three-dimensional body, right? Or we can think of any of these planes of dimensions. And when they're equalized, what would we feel on the bottom of our feet? If we equalize our weight, how should the bottoms of our feet feel when we're in the best management of our body?
I think the feel is going to be what I notice in people when they get to that sort of place is I see the central nervous system kick in.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a breath. There'll be, the person may say something like, wow, this is so easy.
Yeah, whereas opposed when they started, if they habitually maybe never noticed it before, that before they prepare to sit, the weight's in their heels. What does that tell you about the use of their body? Or what would that, if I notice my weight is in my heels right before I sit or as I go to get up, what does that tell me about the use of my own body? Because it's a force.
It
Like
is a
the
force.
the force of our body weight, especially during motion, shifting from the front of our feet to the back of our feet, or evenly distributed through our feet, is how we get feedback about our body's position in time and space relative to gravity, right? So that's kind of the laws of motion in a very direct feedback.
Yeah.
So what would you think, or I should say, if I'm getting up and down out of a chair and I notice I have way more body weight on my heels compared to my toes, what information does that give you as an Alexander instructor?
Well, then I would also look at how are you using your joints? Is being way back on your heels causing a locking somewhere? Because if you aren't in that nice, easy place, you're contracting somewhere.
And then would you say that's the same if I noticed most of my weight was sort of on my toes or to the balls of
Be
my
the
feet?
same thing. So, we can play with that sitting in a chair. As soon as you rock forward onto the balls of your feet, something is going to contract to keep you from falling on your face.
Right. So if we talk about balance, then if I have excessive weight to my heels and almost no weight on the front of my feet,
Mhm.
or if I have excessive weight to the front of my feet and no weight on my heels, either way, that's sort of giving me feedback that my perception of balance is a little bit askew from reality, which by reality, what I mean is a more optimal arrangement of our skeleton with gravity.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we're gonna be using, we're either gonna have misuse in the joint, overuse or lack of use in the muscle, maybe a skeletal relationship that with gravity that creates strain, and maybe it feels like more effort. So like when you say it's effortless, when people arrive there, because I know the complexity of a body, you couldn't tell me one thing
No, I can't.
that would happen. I know. But the weight on our feet as feedback is like a rider's seat bones,
Yeah.
right? Now, when we deal with a force of motion that we're straddling, it's a little different. But if we're just dealing with a static floor and a static chair that isn't moving, I think that's the reason that we need those tools to figure out what we're doing internally as far as how we're managing the forces of our body or our body weight, our mass.
Our mass. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that points of pressure with our feet is just, it's a feedback. It's feedback of, well, okay, now I know that about me. Or is it somebody that, sits at the back of the chair? I imagine most people are going to repeat that when they get on the horse. They're going to be sitting on their pockets. So their center of mass may be behind the center of the motion of the horse.
Yeah, it happens a lot because we
Yeah.
use the term sitting on a horse.
Yes, we do.
And so most people get in a saddle, and because we have habits of use, which is what you're talking about, practicing getting in and out of a chair just makes us aware
Mhm.
of how we do it. And however we typically sit in a chair, because riding a horse is described as sitting in the saddle, most people gravitate to a sitting position, which is different than a standing position. So one of
Right.
the first things I tell people on a horse is find a standing position. Even though we call it sitting in the saddle, we're just riddled with paradoxes in the horse world.
Yes.
Just go with
Yes.
it. Because the feeling of proper balance in a saddle is the arrangement of our body where we would be standing on the ground, not actually sitting.
Exactly. And I'm wondering about when we're talking about all the weight in the heels just on the ground, if we apply that to riding, that heels down
Yeah, it's going to
concept,
have the same effect as
it's
if
going
you
to have
put,
the same exact effect. So I'm going
if
to be
you,
locking somewhere.
right. And it's a great experiment because it's not an opinion. I hate opinions. And I go, I'm not here to tell you not to put your heels down and go against every other trainer on the freaking planet. I'm here to show, I want you to discover for yourself, like we all should, that if I put excessive weight in my heels and lifted my toes while I'm getting in and out of a chair, the effect on my body in relationship to gravity is exactly the same.
Yes.
It's exactly the same. Even though my feet are in stirrups and I can easily push my heels down, it's generating different directions of force.
Exactly.
So if we come back to sort of these ideas of the laws of motion, what are you looking for as far as forces when you're doing chair work with people?
Everybody functions a little different. A lot of people like that oppositional force to find a forward and up motion.
So the direction you're looking for is forward and up.
Yes, that's always the direction.
So what do you mean by forward? What does
Good
that mean in
question.
a body? What does that mean to direct the forces forward? Or how would you know if your forces are not being directed forward?
So forward would be bending at the hips, bending at the knees, bending at the ankles. That would be forward. And what also happens is the
So
extensors kick in to keep you from falling.
so you're tipping your torso forward.
Tipping your torso forward.
Okay, over your leg joints.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're tilting the torso forward is the forward direction, and then upward is, I'm
Up through the
assuming,
top of your head.
what do you mean up through the top of your head?
So you're, instead of thinking that it's a lurching motion, that you're arching your back to get up, which means actually you're locking your joints to try to get up. And that means you're going to have to probably push with your hands. You want to think of going up through the top of your head
And
to get,
allowing the leg joints to change rather
they
than,
open and close. Yeah.
okay,
Rather than it being a big muscular push pull kind of thing.
right. So when we talk about internal forces, we have mass and acceleration that always has direction and magnitude. So as we coalesce the direction and reduce dissipational direction, then it takes less magnitude or less energy to do it because we're sort of bringing the forces into specific directions. So by forward, you're talking about the skull, the spine, and the pelvis. You're primarily talking about managing the direction of the axial skeleton,
Yes.
not the leg joints, and not the, because when we say forward and up, we go, well, doesn't everybody get out of a chair by going forward and up? But it's how. So
It's
when you
how.
say how, that mechanically, if we're organizing our internal spine to be straight and up and down, then it's that spine that's going forward and up.
Yes.
That's the part of the body where we're thinking of pulling the forces together in one direction.
Yes.
So like what you said is if somebody sort of arches their back and pushes up with their hands, the direction of forces are going backwards and downward.
Exactly.
As opposed to forward and upward means the line of force internally is straight between our head and our seat bones.
Yes.
And that line of force is going slightly forward and upward in equal amounts.
Depends upon where you are in the movement, but that's the ideal.
Okay. And
That's
then in
the
a
ideal.
standing position, we're just directly vertically aligned with gravity through the same central axis, which is the axial skeleton, or right from the top of our head down to the middle of our seat bones.
Yes.
So that's what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's very similar, like the chair work in Alexander technique is so similar to the posting or rising trot when we're riding.
Mm.
Or even a half seat, like a 2-point position,
Yeah.
right?
I'd
Because
like to explore that. Yeah.
because that's where most people will do it, like they get in and out of a chair by either arching the spine to be
Yes.
convex or concave. And then depending on all this force through the stirrups or their hands to make up for the bending of the spine.
Yes.
So like 2-point, when you rise and sit, the internal line of force that we manage has to be specifically in the direction of straight rather than bending in any, and it could be lateral bending or horizontal bending forward and back for our spine, but a vertical integrity,
That's a
right?
good way to put it. Yeah.
And so that's where we're equalizing the up and down direction of forces throughout our entire body, right? If we have too much up, we're going to bend that line through our spine.
Yes.
Either, if we have too much down, we're going to bend it. So the human spine can overbend sort of to the front of our body or back of our body. It can also overbend to the left and the right side of our body. So we have a lot to manage to really internally generate a straight line of force. That's reducing forces throughout our body that are other than that one direction. And so what we're doing is sort of gathering energy, which is, I think, why it feels easier when you start there, that you have a specific direction vertically for our axial skeleton. If we don't gather all the forces available in our body to that specific direction, then we also have to increase magnitude in a million different directions, which is what
Yes.
translates to what we feel as more effort.
Yep. More effort, more struggle.
Right. So balance is efficient because we're organizing the forces internally, a straight line of force between our top of our head and our seat bones. And then getting in and out of a chair, you're saying that line of force tilts forward on a horizontal plane and moves upward on a vertical plane.
So it's kind of like posting.
It's exactly like posting.
Yeah.
So when we post, people do all kinds of things, but ideally, the ideal, or most, I shouldn't say ideal, I should say most efficient posting, the way we do it in our body, is like you're describing with the leg joints getting out of a chair. The only parts of my body that I sense moving during rising trot is the hip joint and the knee joint, that's sort of ratcheting my thigh bone forward and back. So in the rise, we're extending or opening the hip joint and the knee joint. And that opening is what actually creates a resistant force to falling forward. We're using
Yes.
joint power instead of muscle power, right? And then the sitting is just a flexion in those same joints. So the spine doesn't have to alter forward, back, left, right, shouldn't bend. It just sort of has the same direction of forward and upward.
Just the same as getting out of a chair.
Right.
In and out
And
of
in
a
the
chair.
rise of the rising trot, we're vertical. And in the sit of the rising trot, that internal straight line simply has more of sort of a 45-degree angle with gravity. Right. So when
Yeah.
people sit and try to be vertical, they can't get out of the saddle to post.
No, and then you're all into momentum.
Yeah. Then you really feel inertia and you really feel the effort of it.
Yeah.
So in the sit, just like sitting, if we sat on the edge of a chair, right? And when we rise, we're standing. And when we sit, I like to use the word folding rather
I
than
like that better than
sitting.
sitting. Yeah.
Because the only way we can flex, and maybe talk about this a little bit, where's the hip joint?
I'm the easiest way to describe it is if you let your arms hang down when you're standing. It's down, way below your waist.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be Now you put your hands down
So
here.
how would I locate my own hip joint? Because this is when I started, I used to imagine my hip joints were on the left and right side of my body.
Right. So the best way is to say they're right here.
So either side of my zipper on my pants,
Yep.
where my
That's how
pants,
deep they are.
right. So they're actually, to think of our hip joint on the sides of our bodies changes our perception of using our hip joint. So knowing that our hip joint is more at the front of our bodies, then you see that the only way to fold or flex the hip joint is taking the torso forward,
Yes.
right? Because I think you always say there's no joint in our ribs. Like our spine is jointed, right? Our spine is jointed. So there's many really joints through our spine from our head to our seat bones, but we don't fold in the middle. But even though everybody does that, that's actually flexing and extending the spine. Where
It's not a true open and closing joint.
right. So in rising trot, if people are arching or hollowing the back, I go straight in the spine, but the hip joint is the joint that moves the whole torso position. So the torso never loses its central straight line of force. It just shifts its relationship with gravity through the leg joints.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is like using the joints during rising trot or the chair work. You don't have the same amount of inherent inertia. It takes less energy, right? The forces directing them is also sort of a coalescence of energy. So it takes less magnitude when all of these various forces are sort of gathering in one specific direction. I think that's the power of keeping our axial skeleton well organized,
Exactly.
not
That's
excessively bending forward, back, left, or right.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah. So rising trot, it's like on the rise, we go up and forward, and on the sit, we go down and back.
Yep.
You find that similar? Would you say that's the direction, the specific direction of our stable straight line? So inside we have a stable straight line, but when we move, that line going forward and up is changing its relationship with gravity to
Constantly.
stand or fold or stand or fold.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's the interplay of all the laws of motion sort of acting in a very simple movement that we either call getting in and out of a chair or rising trot on a horse.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I think we'll have to come back and revisit this a bit more and maybe work on tying together the mechanics with the forces, because I think that's a very big deal. I know it is with riding, because the way we're trained to ride is that when we give an aid, we generate force in order to move body parts inside the horse.
Mm.
And that creates a lot of confusion from the horse's perspective regarding direction and balance. So I think we can come back to this even in the next podcast and explore that idea further of the relationship between the mechanics and the forces. But all of these forces in what we're describing, it's like inertia's at play,
Yes.
magnitude and direction of force is at play, and then equalizing opposing forces, right? So
Yes.
when
So
the
we can
force,
match it, the dynamic matching strategies we can play with. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And really, the whole goal of working or training your body or the horse's body towards more optimal use or balance is the ease of it,
Exactly.
the stability and the ease. It also has less wear and tear on body parts, but it's like it just feels good. And as complicated as we might look at things in Horse Geeks, just because it's kind of fun to explain, the experience of it is what you said earlier. Oh, it's just easier.
It's just easier.
It just feels better. It feels easier. It feels better. There's something about it. People will say, I feel lighter, or I feel more stable. Or a lot of times I'll get these sort of paradox kind of explanations. Like when a horse comes into balance, they'll say, this horse feels so powerful and so soft.
Mm,
And I go, that sort of paradox description is what we can't quite put our finger on it, but it's quite accurate if we consider it's sort of describing Newton's third law of motion. It's this
yes,
and it's that,
it's both.
right? It's both.
Yep.
Absolutely. Anything else you want to add to that?
Now, I think the truth when you say easy is, I think that's, or when somebody comments about that, that's when the central nervous system is giving more input, saying you're going in the right direction.
Ah, yes. Yes.
Because I see people, like I said, they all of a sudden will take a, I'm not going to say deep breath, but a much more relaxed breath.
And you know what I just thought of when we use the word easy? When I was taking regular Alexander technique lessons, I didn't find it easy at all mentally.
No, it's
I
not.
even I found it very difficult mentally
Mhm.
because I was being asked to pay attention to things that I had never paid attention to, and it hurt my brain. And some of the things were not easy emotionally because
Exactly.
it's a little disorienting to make changes in your use.
It can be, yeah.
And so mentally and emotionally, I found it more difficult, especially at first. But physically, I found it easier because it actually is sort of confirmed by the laws of motion. It's confirmed by mechanics, or what we call functional anatomy. It's the physical part of it was what allowed my brain to say, okay, you can deal with this. It'll get easier.
Mhm.
But it really hurt my brain to look at it differently.
Well, and yeah, I think I don't know if I shared this story with you. I had an older gentleman come to me for a lesson, and I, at the end, we were wrapping up, and I said, would you like to make another appointment? And he says, no. He says, I'm not really interested in thinking this much.
That's an honest response.
So,
Absolutely. No, and I will get that from riders with horses who don't like my approach of training because they don't want to think that much.
mhm.
I go, when we have a problem or a pain issue, then we're highly motivated to think that much, right?
That's a good point, because I try to explain to people, wouldn't you rather pay to stay healthy, or would you rather pay
To
to be,
fix what's broken.
to fix what's broken? That
Right.
that to me is, we can, as horse people, we can write a huge list of all the body traumas we've had, that's for
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
But, and so staying pain free, the Alexander technique has given me that gift of, most of the time, that
Yes.
all
And every horse I've ever worked with that was considered difficult or dangerous didn't necessarily have a pain issue that the vet could address and fix.
exactly.
Sometimes the level of discomfort, that threshold is unique to everybody. And sometimes it was a mild discomfort with a very sensitive horse. Sometimes it was quite a significant pain issue without any pathology. And that's related to how we use ourselves mechanically, how we manage the forces of motion during motion. So there's no way to train how to do that in any static therapy. You have to do it during motion.
I
And
totally agree. It's the measure. It's like the difference between me working on somebody as a massage therapist and helping them, but when they go back into their movement patterns, they're going to do the same thing. So if
they're
I
going to
can,
retighten everything you just loosened up
yeah, and if
because
I
of their
can,
pattern of movement.
Exactly. So if I can teach them a better way to move,
Then they don't have the need for the massage.
right? And it's
Yes.
the Alexander technique is a teaching tool. It's
And
not
it's,
a
yes,
therapy. So, and I think that's a really important difference. The student is involved, they're active. Like you said, it's a mentally, emotionally energizing lesson when you have one.
yes.
There's a lot going on.
No, and as a horse trainer, the bulk of my clients who've been with me a long time came because of a huge problem that couldn't be resolved through normal methods or the vet or therapies. And as riders, I actually use the word therapy more because I go, we are what we do every day as the primary weight and mass on the back of the horse and the primary director of forces, which is what we call training and riding. We are the rehabilitators of problems more directly than any other professional, or we're the ones creating the problem, and then we have to pay the professional to undo what happened during training and riding.
Mhm.
So I go, it's very empowering. It kind of hurts the brain like any change of habit. But at the end of the day, like you said, you can take a sound horse and keep them healthy. But through movement, different issues, especially behavior, I go, if they're uncomfortable in motion, there's no amount of psychology that's going to override that. None. There's no amount of pressure and release or condition response or positive or negative reinforcement that's going to make the horse any more comfortable during work. That's,
Exactly.
you have to understand the body and force management, but that's how I overcome 99% of behavioral problems. I go get the comfort in motion, find the ease of motion, working with the laws of the body as a physical machine. It has a structure, and we have laws of motion that apply whether you like them or not, whether you can do the math or not, whether you know about them or not, right? It's like they just work. So we either learn to work with that, or we are all of our frustration, lack of performance, lameness, behavioral problems, bad riding, looking for the right saddle, the right tool, the right gadget, all of that is because we don't get a good education in how these mechanics ideally should work and how to work with them in the relationship of force management.
Yes.
But it's tough. It's mentally and emotionally was more work to make that kind of a change,
yes,
even
it
though
is.
physically. So with a lot of riders, I kind of laugh because I go, if you love that horse, this horse is going to shove you down that path, whether you like it or not. If you don't like the path, you're going to have to get a different horse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we will wrap it up there. And any ideas for the title of today's talk? I'll come up with something, but I think today's title is about practical application of the laws of motion.
Right.
Something like
And
that.
that how we use ourselves, it's not getting somewhere, it's how are we getting there?
Yes. And
That is
that's
the
the
most
only way we
important.
can really look at mechanics and force management is in the how.
It's the
It's not,
how. It's not
yes,
getting to the next jump or um, how much time it takes or all of those things that are really heavy into the horse world or riding to letter A.
well,
Um,
just like getting up and down out of a chair. I never thought about how I did it because I could do the action,
right.
right? So it's interesting in the privacy of our own home. We can kind of play with that
Yes.
and ask ourselves a question. How do I do it?
How do I do anything? How do I
Anything,
brush my teeth? How do I eat? How do I respond to that incoming phone call?
right?
All of that goes into your writing. You take it all with you.
Yeah, because it's a habit.
It's a habit.
And movement is a habit.
Yes,
That's what movement is, a habit. The good news is bad habits can be changed,
exactly.
but they're not easy to change, just like any other habit.
It's a total mental thing.
Yes. All right. Thank you guys for joining us today, and we'll be back next week. So please like, subscribe, share, make comments, ask questions. Happy for them. Until next time, take care and be kind.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.